At exactly 2:30 p.m. on March 1st, 2012, the usual tranquility of the Wenshan apartment complex in Taipei was suddenly shattered. Violent crashing sounds mixed with agonizing screams echoed from the basement level, making the air feel suffocating. Nearby residents rushed into the hallway, only to freeze in horror at the nightmarish scene before them, as if they had wandered into a haunting horror film. A woman lay unconscious in the walkway, her weak arms wrapped around her neck, which was bleeding continuously. Dark red blood spread across the cold tile floor as her breathing grew weaker and weaker. Then, in helpless defeat, her hands slowly loosened and went limp. Immediately, an emergency call was placed to Taiwan's 119 rescue hotline. Less than 10 minutes later, the sounds of police and ambulance sirens engulfed the old apartment complex. Emergency medical teams rushed straight to the scene of the tragedy. When they arrived, they witnessed a heartbreaking sight. The woman lying on the cold hallway floor, her eyes half closed, her face pale, showing no signs of life. A deep wound on her neck was still bleeding. Blood had soaked through her clothes and formed a large pool on the tile floor. Meanwhile, the investigation team from the Wenshan police station quickly arrived to seal off the entire area. The basement-level hallway of the Wenshan apartment complex became the crime scene of a tragic murder. Scattered drops of blood created a haunting trail from the apartment door to the hallway, clear evidence of the victim's desperate flight in the final 33 feet of her life before her strength gave out. Right next to the apartment threshold, investigators discovered a wide-bladed beetle nut-cutting knife, its surface still sticky with blood. This was the murder weapon. Stepping inside the apartment, a chaotic scene unfolded. The living room was in disarray with bottles of alcohol and half-finished drinks on the table, a plastic chair overturned, all indicating that a violent confrontation had just taken place. Pieces of paper were scattered across the table and floor. When carefully collected and examined, they discovered these were police reports and applications for a protective order that the victim had just received from the police station only a few hours earlier. This cruel reality left the entire investigation team stunned. The protective order application with the bright red official seal now lay mixed in the pool of congealed blood, becoming the most haunting evidence at the scene. It served as a silent accusation of the system's powerlessness, while signaling that the story behind it held many more tragic twists. At the scene, a man with clothes stained with blood stood swaying like a lost soul. His vacant stare and the strong smell of alcohol emanating from him clearly indicated severe intoxication. Although they couldn't immediately confirm this person's identity or role, given the obvious signs of involvement in the incident, law enforcement decided to bring him to the station for questioning and investigation. In the early hours, identifying the victim proved quite difficult. The man at the scene remained in a dazed state, unable to provide clear information. Therefore, investigators had to search for clues from other physical evidence. The forensics team began meticulous work examining the victim's personal belongings. In a small purse thrown in the corner of the room, they found the first important clue: a residence card for foreign nationals. The card clearly showed the name Ninh Lefung, Vietnamese nationality, married status, and legally permitted to reside in Taiwan. However, to ensure absolute accuracy, police verified the information through multiple sources. Another crucial piece of evidence found was the protective order application still bearing the original signature and authentication seal from the Wenshan police station. This document detailed the wife's name as Ninh Lepung, the husband's name as Huang, and the submission time recorded as 1:35 p.m. on the same day, March 1st, 2012. Police immediately contacted colleagues at the Wenshan station to verify the information. As expected, the duty officer confirmed that they had just received a Vietnamese woman in a state of panic, reporting domestic abuse and requesting emergency protective orders. Simultaneously, the investigation was expanded to learn more about the victim's circumstances and relationships. To paint a complete picture of this unfortunate woman's life, the investigation team had to seek assistance from Taiwan's Immigration Management Agency. Using information from the residence card number, The immigration office provided a detailed and comprehensive file on this ill-fated young woman. The victim's name was Ninh Le Phuong, born in 1981 in Vietnam. Her childhood was spent in hardship in a poor working-class family in District 11, Ho Chi Minh City. In 1997, when she was only 16 years old, Phuong decided to marry a much older Taiwanese man through a marriage brokerage arrangement. With fragile hopes for a brighter future, she left her homeland to follow her husband to Taiwan, settling in the Wenshan district of Taipei. They had 2 daughters. In the eyes of those around her, Phuong was known as a virtuous wife and devoted mother with a quiet but patient and enduring character. She both cared for her family and worked diligently to help improve their economic situation. Her job was as a factory worker at a shoe workshop in the Zindian area. Her husband was Hoang Dong-hae, born in 1966, the same man present at the crime scene with a vacant expression and blood-stained clothes. Coming from a poor suburban area in Tainan, Hoang's life had been marked by hardship and want since childhood. His education stopped at middle school before he had to drop out to make a living through various manual labor jobs. Hoang's family situation in Taiwan was also not prosperous. His parents were elderly and frail, and after marriage, he, his wife, and 2 daughters had to live in an apartment owned by his older brother. His main occupation was carpentry, specializing in interior decoration, but he only took on small, irregular jobs. This made the family's income always unstable, failing to ensure financial security. However, the most notable thing the investigation team discovered through scattered accounts from neighbors, information that didn't appear in any official records, was that Hoang had previously been through another marriage. His first wife was also Taiwanese, but the marriage ended due to his violent nature. This discovery was like an important puzzle piece in the overall picture, raising serious hypotheses about the crime's motive. It was very likely that the tragic death of the gentle Vietnamese woman stemmed from prolonged domestic violence. This further motivated the investigation team to work tirelessly to uncover the truth and bring justice to the unfortunate victim. Immediately after completing the crime scene examination, Taipei's investigative agency deployed full force to decode the case. While waiting for the appropriate time to interrogate Hoang, the forensic and evidence specialist teams worked continuously without rest, gradually unveiling the mystery surrounding this horrific incident. The forensic report provided clear and heartbreaking conclusions. The victim's cause of death was excessive blood loss, caused by a severe wound to the neck area, a fatal injury completely consistent with the characteristics of the beetle nut-cutting knife found at the scene. Particularly, small cuts were discovered on the victim's hands, which experts identified as defensive wounds, evidence that she had tried to raise her hands to block and defend herself in her final moments. The time of death was estimated between 2:40 p.m. and 2:50 p.m. on the same day, precisely matching when neighbors heard the disturbance and called police. Although no signs of sexual assault or other unusual injuries were found, what shocked the forensic experts was the countless bruises of varying degrees found all over the victim's body. These marks showed that the victim had been abused multiple times in the past. The autopsy results not only clarified the cause of death, but also strongly reinforced the hypothesis that this was a premeditated murder, the tragic climax of a long chain of domestic violence. At the scene, the criminal investigation team meticulously collected all important traces: fingerprints, footprints, and blood samples to aid the investigation. The comparison and analysis process proceeded quickly. Fingerprint comparison results showed that the fingerprints found on the murder weapon's handle matched exactly with Hoang's fingerprints. Not only that, DNA analysis of blood stains on his clothes also confirmed that it was indeed the victim's blood, irrefutable physical evidence of his presence at the scene when the incident occurred. Although the Wenshan apartment complex wasn't equipped with security camera systems on the floors, surveillance cameras at the main entrance captured important footage. The film showed Hoang in an intoxicated state, staggering as he returned home around 1:30 p.m. on March 1st. Notably, during the time the crime occurred, no strangers appeared in the area, completely eliminating the possibility that the perpetrator was an outside intruder. Every piece of evidence, every investigation detail pointed like sharp arrows in one direction: the husband, Hoang. To gather more objective and multidimensional information, police conducted extensive interviews with residents living in the Wenshan apartment complex. This work yielded valuable testimonies from multiple direct witnesses. Most of those interviewed confirmed hearing violent arguments coming from Huang and Peng's apartment around 2 p.m. Ms. Liu, who lived directly across from their apartment, provided detailed and haunting testimony. She recounted clearly hearing Peng cry out desperately, "Don't!" Just minutes after those horrific sounds, Ms. Liu witnessed the heartbreaking scene. Feng running out of the apartment, her trembling hands clutching her bleeding neck. Ms. Liu was the first person to call emergency services 119 and became a direct witness to the victim's painful final moments as Feng collapsed right at her doorstep. Another witness living on the floor below also provided important additional information, saying they had seen Huang staggering in the hallway with obvious signs of intoxication. Although no one directly witnessed Feng being attacked, all nearby residents clearly heard the couple arguing loudly. Particularly noteworthy, one witness reported hearing Feng shout in Chinese, "You're useless." Perhaps the last words she spoke before everything fell into terrifying silence. These testimonies were like the final puzzle pieces, helping to reconstruct the entire tragic sequence of events. At the same time, police also expanded their investigation by contacting the owner of the shoe factory in Xindian, where Feng worked. This conversation yielded extremely important information that helped further clarify the events of that fateful day. The factory owner recounted that around 10 a.m. on March 1st, Huang, in an intoxicated state, had suddenly appeared at the workshop, causing chaos with crude curses directed at his wife. In his drunken state, he had groundlessly accused Feng of having an improper relationship with the factory owner. The situation became so chaotic that the owner had no choice but to call local police to intervene and remove Huang from the premises. After this incident, Feng, in a state of shame and exhaustion, asked for permission to take the rest of the day off to go home. However, instead of returning to their apartment, she secretly went to the Wenshan police station to report the entire incident and submit an emergency protective order application around 1:35 p.m. The duty officer at the station confirmed this information and described Feng as being in a state of panic and exhaustion. She recounted with a choked voice the times she had been abused by her husband, and especially the morning incident when he came to her workplace to humiliate her in front of colleagues. Her tears and desperate pleas motivated the officer to guide her through completing the emergency protective order application. Before leaving, she was given a stamped official copy as legal protection for herself. But fate was so cruel. Exactly 1 hour later, they received news that the unfortunate woman in the tragic case was Feng, the same person who had just come to them seeking legal protection. These testimonies and evidence gradually solved the puzzles, and there was no longer any doubt that the perpetrator was the husband. The remaining questions were about this man's motives and psychological factors. On the evening of March 1st, extending into the early morning of March 2nd at Taipei Police Headquarters, Huang underwent long hours of interrogation by experienced investigators. Instead of showing remorse or fear, Huang displayed indifference, even seeming pleased as if he had just completed something to be proud of. When asked about his actions, Huang confessed straightforwardly without any intention of concealment. "Yes, I did it. She dared to call me useless and incompetent, even waved that protection paper to threaten me. I showed her that paper couldn't save her life." These cold and cruel statements completely matched the evidence and traces police had collected from the scene. However, investigators still needed to clarify other important questions. Were there any accomplices, or did anyone incite Huang to commit the crime, and was this a premeditated plan or just an impulsive act? To all these questions, Huang firmly denied involvement. According to the suspect's testimony, after being released by police at noon on March 1st following the disturbance at the shoe factory, he continued drinking at home to vent his anger. When Feng returned with the protective order in hand, another argument erupted. In his drunken state, Huang began muttering curses, but this time Feng was no longer patient as before. She rose up in resistance, shouted back at her husband, and held up the protective order, declaring she would seek legal intervention. This action caused Huang to completely lose control. He grabbed the betel nut cutting knife sitting on the table and savagely attacked his wife. Even after Feng was severely injured and ran out to the hallway before collapsing, Huang never intended to call for help, but just stood there muttering final curses. This callousness and brutality shocked even experienced police officers with the suspect's attitude. However, through many hours of continuous interrogation, perceptive investigators noticed signs that Huang was trying to find ways to justify his actions. He continuously emphasized two factors. First, that he lost control due to alcohol, and second, that he was strongly provoked by his wife, leading to such cruel actions. However, when investigators posed sharp questions, if he had truly completely lost control, why did he attack only once and then stop, rather than pursuing to continue the assault? Huang couldn't provide any convincing answers. Investigators meticulously recorded these contradictory details, recognizing they would become important weapons when cooperating with prosecutors in upcoming trials. They understood that the perpetrator would very likely use reasons like alcohol or provocation as a legal strategy to reduce his sentence. Meanwhile, authorities also conducted in-depth research into Huang's past and sought consultation from criminal psychology experts to gain a more comprehensive view of this suspect's character and behavior. Results showed that while Huang's criminal record wasn't completely clean, it mainly consisted of administrative violations related to public disturbance while intoxicated. However, something more concerning was found in local records. Huang was on a special watch list for domestic violence. Specifically, the Wenshan police station had recorded at least 3 reports of Huang being violent with his wife. However, following a familiar pattern in many domestic violence cases, each time police intervened, Huang would either deny or apologize superficially, and ultimately everything would be dropped because Feng would withdraw her complaints and not pursue prosecution. This was quite typical in domestic violence cases, where victims often fall into a cycle of fear and economic dependence. Feng, like many other women in similar circumstances, had repeatedly chosen silence and overlooking the abuse, inadvertently creating conditions for the perpetrator to become more brazen and contemptuous of the law. This disregard for law had caused domestic violence to escalate increasingly seriously. Through accounts from neighbors and acquaintances, Huang's image gradually became clear: a man with extreme patriarchal and conservative thinking. In his mindset, marrying a young wife from abroad was no different from buying someone to completely submit to him. Huang always wanted Feng to live in absolute dependence, no financial freedom, no permission to socialize broadly with the outside world, and having to accept all of her husband's decisions. Deep-seated insecurity about failures in career and finances had transformed into irrational and pathological jealousy. He couldn't accept reality about himself, so he had converted it into control and oppression of his wife. From these analyses, criminal psychology experts concluded that Huang belonged to the typical patriarchal possessive perpetrator type. In his mindset, his wife was not an independent person with basic rights, but just property belonging to him. When he sensed losing control, especially when Feng dared to resist and seek legal protection, hatred and the desire to teach a lesson drove him to action. The way Huang chose to retaliate, a brutal and decisive blow, showed this wasn't the result of momentary anger or loss of control due to alcohol. Instead, it was a manifestation of extreme rage and clear intent to kill, not merely to cause injury. Huang wanted to punish Feng for daring to challenge his absolute authority by seeking legal protection. Based on expert in-depth analyses and all evidence and testimony collected, police were able to reconstruct in detail the entire sequence of this barbaric crime. The overall picture revealed a marriage tragedy that had been smoldering for years, only to explode into a horrific crime in just moments of fate. On the morning of March 1st, 2012, around 6:30 a.m., Feng woke up to prepare breakfast for her 2 daughters as usual. Meanwhile, Huang was still deep in drunken sleep, the aftermath of the previous night's drinking. The hangover still lingered, keeping him in a drowsy state, but when he realized his wife had risen early, an inexplicable irritation arose. Muttered curses passed by, but Feng was used to this and just remained silent, continuing her work. After waking the children and taking them to school, Feng biked to her workplace, the leather shoe processing factory in Sindian. Around 10 a.m., while Feng was concentrating on work, Huang appeared once again to cause trouble. During the hours alone at home, his drunkenness had gradually faded, but was replaced by pathological thoughts caused by alcohol. He began creating groundless scenarios in his head about his wife having improper relationships with others. Jealousy and suspicion kept rising, stoking the flames of anger in his heart. The more Huang thought about it, the more he felt betrayed, and finally decided to personally go to the shoe factory to see the truth. Before leaving, he didn't forget to drink a little more alcohol. The quiet atmosphere of the shoe factory was suddenly torn apart by piercing shouts. All workers looked up to witness a middle-aged man with a disheveled appearance, his entire body reeking of strong alcohol, standing unsteadily at the doorway. Without hesitation, Huang charged straight into the work area, randomly banging his hands on the machinery tables, causing sounds to echo throughout the workshop. His bloodshot eyes swept everywhere, hunting for his wife's figure. Feng, in a state of extreme panic, hurriedly ran over, trying to restrain him while drowning in feelings of shame and fear under her colleagues' curious gazes. But her actions only added fuel to the fire. Huang immediately erupted in crude curses, groundlessly accusing her of having an improper relationship with the factory owner in unacceptable language. When the factory owner appeared to intervene and protect his employee, this only made Huang more furious and out of control. Recognizing the situation had exceeded controllable limits, the owner was forced to contact local police for intervention. Shortly after, 2 police officers arrived at the scene. They witnessed Huang still violently struggling with his wife, while Feng had a pale face and tears streaming down from the indescribable humiliation in front of witnessing colleagues. Police quickly intervened, demanding Huang release his grip and produce identification. Although he intended to resist, faced with the strength of 2 officers, Huang was quickly subdued and escorted out of the workshop. One officer remained to collect initial statements from Feng and the factory owner. The owner, with an indignant tone, recounted Huang's entire harassment and disturbance behavior. Meanwhile, Feng, with a trembling and humble attitude, bowed her head to apologize to the owner for the undeserved trouble her husband had caused. The police car took Huang to Wenshan Police Station, where he faced stern warnings from authorities. According to legal regulations, his public disturbance behavior could completely constitute a serious administrative violation. However, since the factory owner had no intention of requesting criminal prosecution, police could only file a report and require Huang to sign a commitment not to repeat the offense. Around 12:30 p.m., after completing necessary procedures and issuing final warnings, police agreed to let Huang leave the station. In reality, within the legal framework, they had no authority to detain him longer without clear evidence of serious crimes. However, what no one could predict was that immediately after releasing Huang, an even more horrific tragedy would occur just hours later. Meanwhile, after the shock at the workplace, Feng was immersed in deep feelings of shame and despair. Years of patient endurance, hoping things would change, but instead the situation had become increasingly worse. In the young woman's heart, fear about the future was gradually overwhelming all thoughts. After her husband was taken away by police, she asked the owner for permission to take the rest of the day off. Instead of returning home as usual, this time Feng decided to go straight to Wenshan Police Station. Around 1:30 p.m., the image of a small woman with red, tear-swollen eyes entered the police station. Since she wasn't fluent in Chinese, an interpreter was called to assist with communication. In the duty room, Feng detailed the chain of days and months of abuse and threats from her husband, as well as the serious incident that had just occurred at her workplace that morning. The duty officers, with sympathetic and professional attitudes, comforted her and specifically guided her through filling out an emergency protective order application according to domestic violence prevention law regulations. Although this was the first time Feng had proactively stepped forward to report and police had no prior tracking records, they still quickly and dedicatedly helped complete all necessary procedures. The protection application was clearly drafted, specifically stating that she accused her husband Huang of abusive behavior and threats to her life, requesting the court to issue orders prohibiting her husband from approaching, contacting, or having any assault behavior toward his wife. Typically, the review process for official court orders would take several days. But recognizing the urgency of the situation, police immediately issued Feng a certificate confirming submission of the protection application, also called a temporary protective order. They hoped this document, though only temporary, could still somewhat create a deterrent effect on the husband, or at least help the victim feel more secure. At 1:40 p.m., Feng stepped out of the police station with the protective order clutched tightly in her hand. Perhaps this was the first time after years of endurance that a fragile ray of hope lit up in her heart that the law would be a shield protecting her life. But cruel fate had arranged a tragic ending waiting at home. While Feng was completing procedures at the police station, Huang, after being released, slowly walked home, his mood full of frustration and hatred. Around 1:15 p.m., as soon as he stepped into the apartment, he immediately turned to alcohol to soothe his anger. He drank while crudely cursing toward his wife. At 1:50 p.m., the sound of keys opening the door announced Feng's return. Before she could set down her purse, her eyes met the image of her husband sitting cross-legged at the table, his bloodshot eyes looking straight at her with obvious hostility. Continuous curses poured from his mouth. Although she felt trembling, this time Feng was determined not to endure anymore. She gathered all her courage, pulled out the protection application from her purse, and held it straight in front of her husband's face. With a trembling but resolute voice, she declared that if he continued any abusive behavior, he would face serious legal consequences and could be imprisoned. Feng's response was only contemptuous laughter from Huang. He stepped forward, snatched the paper from his wife's hand, then tore it in half and threw it on the floor. Feng burst into angry tears, shouting, "You're useless!" A short sentence, but like a spark igniting Huang's rage. He roared once, immediately grabbing the beetle nut-cutting knife kept on the table. Feng only managed to step back once, not understanding what was happening when her husband had already swung directly at her neck. Feng let out a gurgling sound, both hands desperately clutching her neck. Survival instinct helped her struggle to run out the door despite blood pouring out. Feng staggered out to the hallway calling for help, then collapsed after less than 33 feet. Everything happened in less than 10 seconds. The hallway echoed with neighbors' panicked cries when they saw Feng fall. Only then did Huang slowly step out the door. He looked at his wife's body, jerking slightly a few times before lying motionless in the large pool of spreading blood. An elderly neighbor intended to rush forward to subdue Huang, but he unexpectedly threw the murder weapon to the ground, raising both hands as if signaling he was finished. He stood there with blood-soaked clothes, calmly lighting a cigarette. Huang looked at the chaos around him. Then the corner of his mouth turned up in a bizarre smile before becoming like a lost soul, leaning against the wall, staring blankly into space. Just minutes later, police sirens wailed. Medical personnel and law enforcement rushed up. While medical staff hurriedly took Feng down to the ambulance, police also quickly brought Huang to the station. All events were fully verified. The suspect was detained pending investigation and prosecution, avoiding the risk of him ending his own life, fleeing, or harming the two young children. When being led away, Huang remained calm before news cameras, showing no remorse whatsoever. In the following weeks, police collected additional supporting evidence such as detailed forensic examination results and testimony from the victim's family in Vietnam. Every smallest trace was examined to eliminate other scenarios. Finally, police concluded that Huang had single-handedly carried out the murder of his wife, Ninh Le Phuong, at their home around 2:30 p.m. on March 1st, 2012. The motive stemmed from family conflicts and loss of control while intoxicated, with thuggish behavior intentionally taking the victim's life. The case file was transferred to the prosecutor's office for legal prosecution. In August 2012, Taipei court opened the first trial. Prosecutors charged Huang with a maximum penalty of death or life imprisonment under Taiwan's criminal code. The prosecutor emphasized that the defendant had shown thuggish intent to take the life of his wife, who was protected by law. Evidence collected, including confessions, forensic results, and witness testimony, were all presented in court. The court-appointed defense attorney tried to argue for mitigation, claiming the defendant committed the crime while strongly provoked due to intoxication and being insulted by his wife, completely losing self-control. The lawyer also cited that the defendant was a poor, uneducated laborer, hoping the court would show mercy and give him a chance for rehabilitation. However, the prosecution firmly refuted that the defendant had a history of abuse for many years. Drinking alcohol was his own choice and couldn't be blamed on others. Moreover, after committing the crime, the defendant even calmly smoked while watching the victim gradually fade away. This wasn't the behavior of someone unconsciously drunk, but cold-blooded conscious action. During the trial, Huang spoke little, mostly keeping his head down in silence. When the judge repeatedly asked whether the defendant felt remorse, he only mumbled, "If I did it again, I would still discipline my wife, but be a bit gentler." This shameless statement officially confirmed the defendant's coldness, essentially nailing his own guilt. Even the defense attorney was helpless upon hearing this, unable to salvage his client's image. After all procedures, the first trial verdict was announced. The court determined Huang committed premeditated murder with particularly cruel behavior. However, considering that he committed the crime due to momentary provocation and was middle-aged, the court decided to sentence him to life imprisonment, permanently revoking his civil rights. After hearing the verdict, he initially appeared calm, but shortly after, under the instigation of a fellow inmate, Huang filed an appeal requesting sentence reduction with the old reasoning of committing crime due to provocation and loss of self-control while drunk. This case was transferred to a higher appellate court, but the judge still maintained the original life imprisonment decision, and that concludes today's case. What are your thoughts on this case? Please share in the comments below. Thank you for following along and see you in the next videos.